As a student startup, perhaps you developed a technology in a class, or perhaps you were inspired to develop a product or service as a result of the entrepreneurial buzz on campus. Forming a company requires out-of-pocket costs and continuing filing and tax obligations, so you want to carefully consider whether you actually want to form a company. These are a few steps to take and issues to consider before you actually form the company. Have you talked to a faculty advisor or mentor? Have you talked to them to consider whether this is a viable business to form? Have you done customer discovery? Do you know whether customers would be interested in your technology, in your product or service? Are you actually committed to running a company? Running a company takes a substantial amount of hours and time. And is this something that you see yourself doing for the long haul? Do you have a good team? Is it more than just you who's committed to setting up this startup? Are you willing to work for no pay? Are you willing to move for opportunities for the startup? There are many accelerators that may be outside of the state in which your university is located, and you may need to move. Another preformation issue you want to consider is when you should actually form the entity. First, do you have more than one founder involved in the company? When there's more than one founder involved in a business, you should definitely consider forming a separate business entity. This is because if there's more than one founder, the business could be considered a general partnership, and if it's a general partnership, all of the owners will be fully liable for the debts and obligations of the partnership. You want to form the entity before you hire employees and third-party consultants, because you want to make sure that the individual founders are not entering into the agreement with the employees and consultants, but the business entity is. You also should form a separate business entity when you want to limit liability. As I mentioned earlier, if the founders are involved in a business and they haven't formed that entity, then those individual owners will be fully liable for the debts and obligations of the entity. However, if you form a separate company, a formal business entity, then that business entity will be liable for the debts and obligations of the company, subject to certain exceptions. You would also want to form an entity when you're creating IP and if you have more than one founder who's working on the IP. This is important because if you have individuals who are creating the IP and you don't have a separate entity, then the IP will belong to those individual owners and not to the company. If you set up a separate business entity, then you can transfer the intellectual property into that business entity. You'll also want to set up a separate business entity when you want to issue stock options. Many times startups don't have the money to be able to pay their employees or their third-party consultants with cash or with wages. So they often will provide stock options as compensation for the services that they perform. In order to issue stock options, you must set up a corporation. For non-U.S. citizens and non-permanent residents, in order for them to legally work in the United States, they must work for a business entity. So it's important for them to work with an immigration attorney to figure out the business entity that they should form. Once you decide you're ready to form a business entity, it's important to form that business entity early in order to begin the capital gains tax holding period earlier, so that when you go to sell stock in the company, you'll be able to get the more favorable capital gains tax as opposed to the ordinary income tax. So if you are employed or you have an internship with a company, you want to make sure that you take certain steps before you start your company to make sure that what you're doing with your own company doesn't violate the terms of your agreements with your employer. Before you actually agree to work for a company or be an intern for a company, you should make sure you review various agreements with them to ensure that the work that you're doing with your startup will not be considered the intellectual property of the employer. If you are working for an employer, you should make sure you review any agreements that you may have signed with that employer to ensure that the work that you're doing with your startup doesn't violate these agreements. Some of the agreements may include an employee offer letter, a confidentiality agreement, a proprietary information and inventions assignment agreement, and these agreements contain many different provisions that may impact the activities that you may take with respect to your company. If you're employed with a company, you want to be sure that you limit any pre-resignation activities on your startup. This is to make sure that the employer can't say that they own any of the intellectual property that you've created while you are employed by the company. You also want to make sure you talk to an attorney and have an attorney carefully look at any employment documents that you've signed to make sure that you will not violate those terms.